My name is John Bates, and I've been working at the experiment station here in Burns since, well, the late 80s, actually. Started out doing a cattle feeding trial with Harley Turner, if anyone remembers him. Um, so today I'm going to be talking about some perspectives I have on juniper management um, based on some of the work I've been doing and also out of some of the literature that is available now. Um, some of the topics I'll be going over uh, juniper treatments and then recovery response mainly. And I'll be looking at mainly mechanical and prescribed fire, fuels management, kind of integrated with that, and a little bit about herbicide applications, which seem to be people having more interest in this area on it. And in terms of recovery response, I'll go over a little bit of data on composition, response, forage production, hydrologic recovery, and some of the benefits and problems of each of the different types of juniper treatments that are being used today. Okay, some of the parameters in terms of vegetation, I'm just going to be discussing the response on areas that are being treated that are mainly native dominated in the understory. When you have a understory which is mainly annual grasses like cheatgrass or medusa head, that's more of a weed problem than a juniper problem. And so you kind of have a dual problems there. You have to not only treat the trees, but you also have to treat the understory, which is expensive. And for tree species and plant associations, I'll mainly be talking about Western juniper. There's a little bit of overlap with Rocky Mountain juniper and Utah juniper, at least in the northern portions of their range. And in terms of sagebrush types, I'll mainly be going over mountain, but a little bit of Wyoming sagebrush response and basin. If anyone has any questions on Aspen, we can do that. If there's any questions at the end, I'm not going to cover that at all today. A little bit of just a background. I'm not going to go over juniper expansion per se, except talk about the different phases that people have kind of placed the succession into. So we have early succession or phase 1, mid succession phase 2, and then late succession phase 3. With phase 3s, you can kind of get it'll show up depending on what soils you're on. So most juniper sites are on little deeper soils or don't have a restrictive layer, so like fractured bedrock. So the understory is in pretty good shape, but then you do get into woodlands that have a restrictive layer, and the soils are shallow, and your understory is really depleted, and you have a lot more bare ground and erosion problems with those areas. Now, for mechanical control, just looking at herbaceous recovery, and this is just very generalized. Herbaceous recovery, depending on the phase you're treating, cover responses is 0 to 2 years on phase 1s and phase 2s. Production 0 to 3 years post treatment will recover. Shrub recovery is fairly variable, anywhere from almost instantaneous recovery because you're on a phase 1 where you actually did the mechanical treatment, to who knows how many years, because when you do a mechanical treatment in say phase 2, the understory is in good enough shape to where it's going to be competing with the shrubs, and so it's hard for new shrubs to establish in those areas. So it may take longer. Composition, that's really based off of what kind of site that you're on in terms of response. Generally on these areas, composition doesn't change a lot if it's a phase 1 or phase 2 because the species composition is pretty complete in those areas. It's only when you get into phase 3s where you can get some major shifts in composition in terms of recovery and species. On phase 3 woodlands, herbaceous recovery is a little more variable. Cover anywhere from 1 to 10 years to get back to kind of that complete cover that's affecting your hydrology on the site. Density, usually under 10 years, you'll start getting a lot more recruitment. Excuse me. when you do a mechanical treatment or really any kind of treatment on these juniper woodlands, you don't get a lot of seed production until that second or third year after treatment. And then when you start seeing recruitment is generally within that third, fourth, or fifth year where you're starting to see more seedlings showing up. Production on the work we've done, it's anywhere from 3 to 10 years to get back to, say, that site potential for herbaceous production. Shrub cover, again, is highly variable. Some areas it can come back pretty quickly, almost too quickly to where it can suppress the understory. And other areas that we still have a site up on Steens Mountain we started back in 91, and the shrubs are still not back to that site potential after 30 years. In fact, on that particular area, the juniper is coming back in fast enough to where the shrubs will probably not recover to their full potential. Fuel treatments, most of the concerns with juniper with mechanical has to do with fuel treatment. It's now because kind of in the old days when juniper was, at least in Oregon, when they were first starting to treat juniper, they did a lot of chainsaw cutting. And a lot of times the trees were just left in place. But as you see here, this is a phase 3 woodland that was cut. And when you get into mid-succession, late succession, you get a lot of fuel on the ground. Mid-succession anywhere from 3 to 15 tons, and late succession up to 15 to 35 tons per acre. So that has to be treated because of the fuel hazard. And there's a number of methods that have been applied here in our area. One is just broadcast burning in the fall or late spring. Pile burning, where they cut the trees and then they come in with the usually track with the. I'm losing my mind here. With a pile trees, you'll get 8 to 10 trees, maybe 12 trees per pile, and they'll burn those usually in November or December after the first fall rains. Jackpot burning is one where you're just going tree to tree, burning the flashy stuff off, and that doesn't get all the wood, but it does get all the needles and small twigs burnt off. And then, of course, mastication is probably the most complete way to reduce your fuel hazard because it does it in one shot. You don't have to come back in after you cut the trees. You can just masticate the tree, and that takes care of your fuel problem, at least on most areas. Like early or late succession, there's not a lot of debris left. On phase 3 woodlands, when they're masticated, you can get quite a bit of pile up of debris on those areas, and they can burn and cause some problems. There was one of the Joint Fire Science studies down in Utah had a wildfire go through one of their mastication treatments, and I think it caused a lot of problems when it went through that. But generally, there's not a lot of fuel problems after a mastication treatment. This is some examples of different treatments. So comparing broadcast burning with jackpot burning, we've done quite a bit of work on that. So the top left corner here, that's a broadcast burn, and then this is a jackpot burn in the winter. And you can see there's a big difference when you do the broadcast burn in the fall. There's a lot more bare ground. You get a lot more fuel burnt off, but this area is a lot more open for cheatgrass to come in. And on the lower right-hand corner, that's a winter burn, and it just burns down to like barely gets into the 10-hour fuels, which would be anywhere from a 1/4 inch to an inch in diameter. Barely gets into that. And so there's most of the understory around the stump and beneath the tree is unaffected by that burning off that flashy stuff. And so you don't really have a weed problem on those areas. You do have a lot of wood still left on the site, and that's gonna take a long time to decompose and go away. Just some comparisons on what's going on when you compare, say, a broadcast treatment with the jackpot. So the top photo there is a September burn, actually, and the soil temperatures after when they're burning are getting real hot, and so that's how it's killing out your perennials. And what happens is you can see the cheatgrass coming in there, and this would be about 2 to 3 years after the fire. And another year or two, that'll be just solid cheatgrass in those areas where most of the fuel is burnt off on those broadcast fires. And then the low severity fires, usually when I burn those, I do it at field capacity and when the soils are frozen, even snow on the ground, and there's no heat pulse into the ground at all. And that's one reason. And like I said, the fuel consumed is generally less than the 1 hour fuel level. So that's why you don't get a lot of mortality. And so you kind of you'll maintain your understory in that case with that jackpot burn. And just an example, comparing the two on the slide, that the figure that just came up in the top right there shows comparisons of April, September, and winter burning. Then that's just the unburned control next to it. So higher perennials in the winter burn compared to the fall burn, and higher cheatgrass in the fall burn than the winter burn. And that's for the whole plot. When you kind of break it down by area, down here in the lower left-hand corner of the slide here, it shows so September, October, or April burn and around the stump and cut tree, and also the interspace. So with those real hot fires with high fuel consumption, the cheatgrass cover this would have been a couple years afterwards, 15% cheatgrass and 8% perennial. And then with the winter burn around that stump and cut tree, cheatgrass cover was only 1%, and the natives were 36%. And then interspace, there's no difference in interspace between the two different treatments. So the more fuel you get down in the ground, the more area is going to be affected. So usually, well, for this site that we burned here, I think juniper cover is about 15%. And when you lay the trees over, that increases the potential area that's going to be heavily impacted up to about 22%. But when you get higher levels of juniper cover, you're going to be increasing that heat on the soil, and so you're going to have a lot more larger area affected. So that's why, at least on our experimental range, we've gone to completely. When we do mechanical treatments, we go all with these jackpot burns. And for one guy can go around with a drip torch and get about 3 to 5 acres done in a day. And that's with about 6 to 7 hours worth of work. So it does take some time. So you're not going to be treating large areas on a daily basis. A little bit about the cut and pile burning. This was a site we did up north of Burns, real high juniper cover. It was right up against the pine forest, so kind of an ecotone with the sagebrush steppe and pine areas. There's scattered pine throughout the area. So what they do here is they come in, chainsaw it, go around with a track hoe with the thumb, and they pile these trees, let them dry for a year, burn them, and burn those piles in late fall the second year. And the recovery is pretty good on these areas, even on these high juniper covers. They've done this in aspen stands as well, where you get even higher juniper cover. And on this particular area, so 45% juniper cover, about 8 to 15% of that area, you have these real sore spots, which don't have a lot growing on them. You can reseed into these areas, but they've not had a lot of success on that. And I think that's more with the seed mix. This particular area is mostly western needlegrass in the understory, and that seems to reseed into these burn spots pretty well. Another thing to plant into these hot spots is sagebrush seed or bitterbrush. They seem to do real well in these kind of mineral soils, and they do tend to show up on these real hot spots when they do come back into the area. So a quick overview on benefits of mechanical treatments on an ecological and management perspective. Of course, recovery is generally faster than prescribed fire. Herbaceous production, depending on what phase you're treating, you might not see an increase, or you could get up to a 7-fold increase on some of these late phase three juniper controls. Species diversity, Again, that kind of depends on what phase you're treating. Usually on phase 1 and phase 2 sites that are treated, there's not really a change in your species diversity, but on some of these phase 3 sites, you can get up to a 2 to 3-fold increase in species diversity. Extended growing seasons, that's particularly on phase 3 sites. You might see that where your growing season, at least until the understory fills in, you might see an extended growing season about 4 to 8 weeks, at least within the first decade that you did the treatment. Another advantage of this treatment is you retain the shrubs so they're not burned off like you would with a prescribed fire. The hydrologic recovery is usually pretty quick on phase 1 and phase 2 sites. It's almost, there's no problems with it coming back. That's usually the first year you'll not see any change. On phase 3s, that depends on if it's a deep soil site or a shallow soil site. Some of these shallow soil sites will take a number of years to come back, at least 3 years, but maybe up to 10, depending on how quickly that area fills in with understory cover. From a management perspective, most of these mechanical treatments you can apply year round, and control is pretty easy, so you're not going to lose it. The only restrictions would be really wet soils where you may not want to do any kind of compaction damage, but generally you can apply these treatments year round. Some of the problems we've seen when we've done mechanical treatments, it can benefit weeds in certain areas. When you lay these trees over, some of our native perennial grasses are kind of susceptible to that smothering when trees are left on the ground. Thurber's needlegrass is one species that gets killed out pretty easily underneath these trees, and then you have cheatgrass will come in about 3 or 4 years after the trees have been down. Once the needles are off and the nitrogen levels start coming up underneath these trees, that's when you start having cheatgrass come in. In a lot of these areas, it may not have had much to begin with. Juniper and shrubbery invasion, juniper especially, none of these mechanical treatments get the little guys that are still hanging around underneath the trees or underneath the shrubs. Plus, you probably got a pretty good seed bank in the area, so it's going to need to be retreated, and that's an additional management cost you have to plan for in the future. For a grazing perspective, usually on most of these mechanical treatments, grazing is not restricted, at least on phase 1 and phase 2 sites, because you already have a pretty good understory. It's phase 3s where you may have to be a little more cautious if you need to have plant recruitment. And I stated earlier that you see the big seed production coming in that 2nd or 3rd year, and then new plants coming in right after that. So you want to adjust your grazing to allow to maximize your seed production those years, and also encourage recruitment in those later years. Management, of course, it's generally costlier than prescribed fire. There's a fuel hazard, although in most cases nowadays, that fuel hazard is addressed with most mechanical treatments, so it's becoming less of a problem. Of course, as I mentioned before, mastication takes care of that problem with the initial pass through, so you don't have to come back in and do any more additional treatments. With some of these areas, it gets difficult to seed without tree removal. So mastication again is a good one too, because you don't have that interference with the trees that you would say get with the cutting and piling, that sort of thing, or chaining, any kind of chaining, bulldoze chaining. Okay, prescribed fire. Kind of going over some things on woodland phase response and ecological site, and then a little bit about how a lot of these prescribed burns are done with some sort of partial cut and burn, where a certain portion of the trees are cut to carry the fire up through these woodlands. So what we've seen on our sites and through the literature on burning on phase 1 and 2 woodlands, herbaceous recovery is usually complete within 2 to 3 years, and production within 2 to 4 years post-fire. Shrub recovery is variable depending on usually on post-fire weather and what species you're dealing with. Most mountain sites recover a lot faster than any Wyoming big sagebrush sites that burn. A lot of our fires that we've done, there's new mountain big sagebrush plants within the first year after burning, and they're producing seed by the second year. So they can recover within as short a time period as 12 years, although the average is about 35 years for mountain big sage. For Wyoming big sage, there's not a lot of good data on how fast that comes back, but our estimates are at least about 125 to 150 years on those areas for Wyoming big sagebrush. Ecological site recovery again can be a little bit variable on the drier sites compared to the wetter sites. So wetter sites tend to recover a little faster than the drier sites. So usually that's elevation or aspect related. As I mentioned, post-fire weather is real important for, it seems like sagebrush recruitment, at least according to some of the studies that have been done in the past. You really need wet years plus good snowpack to kind of get that recovery. We did some Wyoming big sagebrush burns, and it's been over 20 years, and we're finally seeing some decent recruitment the last couple of years because we had good snowpack and wet summers. And so it probably is a pulse on Wyoming big sagebrush with mountain big sage. It looks like because there's already a pretty good seed bank with that, and you tend to be higher elevation with better moisture. So that's one reason why it recovers a little faster than Wyoming big sagebrush. For phase 3 woodlands, herbaceous recovery is usually 3 to 4 years post-fire. It can be longer than that. Production, same thing, about 4 years, although it can be extended out a few more years after that. Shrub recovery, again, is highly variable. Wyoming big sagebrush, very slow, and mountain big sage, that again depends on how severe the fire was and how it affected that seed bank that's there. But usually it can be fairly rapid. Ecological site, again, same sort of thing as phase 2 sites. It all kind of depends on what ecological site you're working on. And species and post-fire weather, same thing as the other phases, how it affects recovery of those shrubs. Now for partial cut and burn, we've mostly done that in late phase 2 and phase 3 woodlands. Essentially what you're doing, you're cutting a portion of the trees, letting them dry for a year, and then running a fire up through there to get the rest of the trees that are remaining. We did do a study on South Mountain where we compared how many trees you need to cut on a site, and for fall fire, we're getting anywhere from 15 to 33% of the trees you might have to cut, and that's related to how dense the trees are, and topography as well. Slope helps, so you can cut fewer trees on steeper slopes compared to flat areas. Well, of course, flat areas you're going to need a little more wind to carry that fire through these woodlands. And on spring fires, that was an aspen study we did, and we had to cut about 50 to 80% of the trees to really kill the rest of them. Anything below 50% wasn't successful at getting rid of most of the juniper that remained. So comparison of, we did a study here recently that after 20 years, post-fire comparison on a mountain sagebrush fescue site up on Steens Mountain. And that was comparing recovery on phase 2 and phase 3 woodlands. The phase 2 woodlands, the first decade came back, natives dominated it, and the phase 3 sites were dominated by cheatgrass, and actually a lot of snowbrush came in those areas. Very hot fire, killed out most of the natives. The perennial grass density went from about 7 or 8 plants per square yard down to under half a plant per square yard. So a lot of mortality. And so cheatgrass, the first, say, decade after the fire, dominated this area. But we just measured this a couple years ago, and so that had been 20 years. And you can see here with this slide, this shows herbaceous cover. The green is native vegetation, and the gray is non-native, and that's cheatgrass. So the fire was in 2003, and the first couple of years, sites were dominated by native, a lot of native annuals. And then in 2006, the cheatgrass started really increasing, particularly on the phase 3 sites. And those areas were, of course, dominated by cheatgrass for at least that first decade and probably a little longer. We came back and started measuring those in 2018 and 2023, and you can see how it's changed. The cheatgrass is getting pushed out by the perennials, and by 2023, it's the two sites are pretty well. The two different phases of woodlands are pretty much the same in terms of herbaceous recovery. The only difference here is forb covers a little less on the phase 3 sites compared to the phase 2 sites. So a better perennial forb composition on the phase 2 sites than the phase 3s. Shrub recovery is about the same on the two. For a while there, it was a little higher on the phase 3 sites because of the snow brush, but that's been getting pushed out by snowberry and mountain sagebrush recently. So even the shrub composition shifted as well. So some comparisons with woodland phase 1 and 2. Generally, those are pretty predictable in terms of response, whether it's fire or mechanical, and generally do not require further inputs such as seeding or weed control. On phase 3 sites, pretty predictable results on mechanical and jackpot burning. But when you start getting into fall prescribed fire, it becomes less predictable, even on really sites that have very little annual on it. Almost all these areas that we burn with phase 3, the annual is going to increase on it. It just depends on how effective your perennials are in coming back into those areas. And so sometimes patience is required, like we did on that Steen site. But I would recommend on any burn phase 3 sites that some seeding be done with native bunch grasses, just to speed that recovery along, rather than having to go through that cheatgrass phase, and particularly on any kind of lower elevation sites. So benefits to fire, pretty similar to mechanical. In terms of ecological perspective, herbaceous production, anywhere from a 2 to 7-fold increase, depending on what phase was treated or what the site potential is. Species diversity up to 2 to 5-fold increase, and you're probably going to get a few surprises. Some of these species that are considered rare and endangered, like there's a mallow that up on Steens, it's listed as rare and threatened. And on these hot fires, it comes in very thick. Coyote tobacco is another one that shows up on a lot of these hot fires. Similar to mechanical, you can get extended growing season, particularly the first few years after the fire. Hydrologic recovery is usually within the first couple years after the fire as the understory recovers. I better plug. Hold on a second. I got to plug my. Okay. It does represent historic disturbance, except for maybe burning those phase 3 sites where you get those crown fires and a lot of heat into the soil with a lot of mortality of your perennials. That's probably not related to a historic fire disturbance, when most fires would have been in these phase 1 and phase 2 sites where it was easy for fire to carry. Generally, management, it tends to be lower cost per acre unless, of course, it escapes on you. You can treat larger areas usually within that one season, and that treatment always will last longer. It takes a lot longer for trees to come back into these burned areas than these mechanical treated areas. And we did do a study on that as well. Some of the ecological problems, one is it can really benefit weeds, even with a very good perennial understory prior to the treatment. If it gets hot enough, you can kill out a lot of the perennials. So that's a problem. Old junipers are really susceptible to burning, especially when you're carrying fire up through phase 3 woodlands. Even the ones that are on these protected areas, all on rocky rims are susceptible to the heat that's coming up, and a lot of firebrands flying around. So they're easy to tell in the landscape. That picture in the top right corner is one old woodland, is one old tree that is banana peeled out, and we burned a lot of old trees on our experimental range with fall fires because of the amount of fire flying around when we do our prescribed burns. So that's one reason we've gone to more jackpot burning on our experimental range. Can delay shrub recovery compared to mechanical treatments. Of course, habitat can be affected, especially if you're taking out sagebrush, which sage grouse are depending on. Can worsen hydrologic attributes, especially on areas that had a good understory prior to the fire, and then you have a lot more bare ground exposed. So again, that'll take a number of years to recover. Management, it can be more costly than mechanical if it escapes, and that does happen. If anyone's done prescribed burning, they probably had that experience. Grazing management becomes a little more involved if you're doing any kind of reseeding. And of course, additional inputs are probably going to be required on some of these areas, which means seeding and potential weed control, which are all expensive. A little bit about seeding. We've done some work with it on different woodland phases and treatment types. Our most successful seedings are usually after fire and not mechanical treatments, just because there's a lot less competition to deal with. And a lot of it depends on site characteristics. So for seeding, we've tended to go on any of our studies with introduced bunch grasses when we're below a 12-inch precip zone or 5,000 feet on just about any aspect. And as you get up higher elevations, south and west aspects, again, we have tended to go with introduced bunch grasses on those areas versus natives, just because they're more successful at establishing and competing with cheatgrass. Native bunch grasses are the opposite, and then you go a little higher precip and a little higher elevation. They're very successful. Kirk Davies has done a lot of work with sagebrush recruitment on these fires, and one thing that's you have to watch out for on sagebrush seeding is not seeding it too heavy. You can get it to where it's too heavy a seeding, and the sagebrush comes in faster than your perennials can really establish and grow, and it can suppress your forage production and herbaceous cover quite a bit. That lower right-hand photo there shows the number of seedlings have come up after one of his treatments that it did after a fire we had on Squaw Butte, and that level of density is going to be problematic for the herbaceous plants that were also seeded in with that. So go light with sagebrush seed. And in most cases, mountain big sagebrush areas don't need to be reseeded because usually there's an adequate seed bank. The only time you might want to seed those areas would be on a phase 3 site where it's been largely pushed out by the trees. And as I mentioned, hydraulic recovery for post-fire, usually 1 to 3 years on mechanical, 0 to 3 years it recovers. It just takes that amount of time for the vegetation to fill in. And it is dependent on site. Recovers faster on earlier succession woodlands versus late succession woodlands. A little bit on herbicides. There's been herbicide applications for years done on juniper. There was one they did at Squaw Butte back in the 60s where it was pelletized picloram, and they did not get good kill on that, and that's because they did it in a high clay soil, which tends to soak up that herbicide. But there's been some recent work being done with pelletized picloram as well, and it's very effective on small trees. I think it's 1 pellet every 2 feet that you need to apply for killing a tree. There's also foliar sprays. They're mostly effective on the small trees, not very effective on larger trees. Usually, I think that's usually when they get above 4 to 6 feet. And then I'm going to go over, some of you may have seen this. Their Monument, Oregon, the Saltwater Conservation District set up a trial looking at using herbicides with blaze cuts and slash cuts, and then squirting herbicides into those wounds. And their most effective treatments were with Tordon and Tordon mixed with Milestone, where they were getting 90 to 98% mortalities after 2 years. And what they were doing a blaze cut or a slash cut, which is that lower photo. And the application on that is you want the bark there between the wounds on the tree has to be less than 4 inches. They found out the blaze cuts were a little more effective, and a 3 to 4 gallon backpack sprayer tank will treat anywhere from 750 to 2,000 trees, depending on the size. And so you have one guy with the saw and one guy with the sprayer on. They can treat. They said they can treat. I can't remember the number of trees per acre. It was in how many trees they could treat in a day. I think it was 10 acres. But I'd have to check back on that. But it was costing them about 45 to 55 bucks an acre to treat this. And that's cheaper than a lot cheaper than chainsaw cutting, any mechanical treatments, as well as probably prescribed fire. The only issue you're going to have is these trees dry, you're still going to have a fuel hazard for a number of years until those needles fall off. But it's very effective. And the understory recovered very well on these sites. So I thought I'd just cover that real quickly.